Well, Pam, which way you going? Left or right?
Right.
That's too bad.
Why?
Well, because it was a 50-50 shot on whether you'd be going left or right. You see, we're both going left. You could have just as easily been going left, too, and if that was the case, it would have been a while before you started getting scared. But since you're going the other way, I'm afraid you're gonna have to start getting scared immediately.
There's no more room in hell. The dead will walk here.
I just can't take no pleasure in killing nothing. Just some things you gotta do. Death has come to your little town, Sheriff.
You gotta be fucking kidding.
Who's laughing now? Be one of us. Join us! Join us! Join us! Well, we'll just wait here for a little while. See what happens.
Good evening, campers, dreamers, and babysitters, and welcome to, yes, another edition of SplatterCast. I'm your host, Dylan Newell.
And I'm Luke Janesco.
Alrighty, and today's episode, as you can see, we are going to be talking Hellraiser 1987 in preparation for the new one, which, as of recording this, is what, like 2 weeks from now?
Is there a new Hellraiser coming out?
Oh, there is a new Hellraiser coming
I
out.
didn't
Did
hear
you
about
not?
this.
Were you not a part of the video earlier last week where we talked about it for
Was
a little
that
bit?
me or I
No.
don't think that was me, brother. I think that
I'm
was someone else.
confused at this point then because it looked like you.
We
So,
have a
I don't
dead
know.
ringer situation here from David Cronenberg. So you know.
Very, very good. But yes, we are discussing the original Hellraiser. This was, as I've been teasing, I teased a little bit back in our Child's Play episode. If you watched that, Child's Play 2, that this is a movie I have never seen. So this was the first time I had ever seen Hellraiser.
You have a lot of big gaps in your horror filmography there,
I
sir.
don't know. I feel like we're tying those up pretty quick, though. I don't think
Yeah,
I
we
have
are.
a lot of them.
I mean, you didn't see
like
Spawn, and I was like,
okay,
Spawn
but
here.
Spawn is Spawn, but you know that's more of a you thing. But for me, yes, I know that this one is a sin, and my lack of other than the first one of seeing Child's Play or Chucky related content can also be regarded as a sin. But I think for the most part, this really ticks off my last box for the real big heavy hitters.
yeah.
I think like slasher characters for sure, even though I don't necessarily consider this a slasher at all. But like, you know, as far as those icons go, like I'm pretty sure that this wraps it up for me.
Yeah, you know, and I'm obviously just messing with you. Like looking at Hellraiser here, very different playing field than what you would think in terms of. I think maybe I mentioned this somewhere, maybe in the Hellraiser breakdown. But where Hellraiser or Pinhead was kind of always in the same conversation in terms of like a Jason Voorhees or a Michael Myers. Like I'd always see them on the like haunted house kind of ads and things like that. And then kind of Pinhead fell off a little bit, where looking at this film, especially released when it was, very different tone than any of the other stuff, you know? So I can see why this would be in a different conversation and maybe a gap in a lot of people, kind of horror fans of not getting around to seeing Hellraiser, because this is a very different film.
Yeah, and I mean, like, just coming off the top, one of my biggest surprises, considering he is the icon of the franchise and he is literally the cover of every poster and everything, is the lack of Pinhead in this movie. And I mean, we'll get into it a little deeper, but yeah, like that was pretty surprising.
Yeah, and you know, obviously, I'm sure you have your production stuff where it became kind of a need to kind of have him be the focal point, but also I did watch. I gave Hellraiser 2 a watch as well, and Pinhead's in it, but again, not a ton of Pinhead. Not in terms of what you would think of where they would take this franchise, or where you think it would be in that very first one. I mean,
Yeah, and we'll
it's
be
different.
saving Hellbound for another podcast, I'm sure.
Yeah,
But I think, like, it was important, especially leading into this recent one. We had talked about this before we recorded this episode, that Hellbound is essential viewing for us at this point, because we want to get more familiar with these two films, especially with the new one coming out, because they've the writers and directors have said that they pull a lot from the first two. And it's just one of those things where it's like, those seem to be the most important on anybody's catalog when it comes to this character or this franchise. Once you get into three and then everything else, it's kind of up to your discretion.
yeah,
So, that's why it's like, we'll be touching on Hellbound, but we won't be going too deep into spoilers. But one of the spoilers I want to mention for Hellbound, which I think goes back to our conversation here about the lack of Pinhead, is how even in the sequel, it seems like these films have alternative antagonists in
yeah,
these first two films. And, Hellbound has two, but it is one of those things where it's like, this is very much, Pinhead is a bad guy, but he's not necessarily the main focal point or the one that's causing the issues. There is another character in play that is more or less the nefarious, getting involved and ruining things kind of guy.
yeah. Again, a very different kind of concept here as to what you would think. Living through the slasher '80s, you would think, okay, we have Jason Voorhees is our main antagonist. That's the force. That's who we're going with. Same thing with Michael Myers. I mean, Leatherface. All the usual suspects there. You have a very specific dynamic, whereas Pinhead is almost the accompanying kind of residual effect of, you have your protagonist, your antagonist, and now here's Pinhead because he's been called upon because of opening, I guess you'd say, Pandora's box, whatever you want to, you know what I mean, where it's like all these Cenobites come just as a residual effect. So it's kind of, he's not always the main antagonist of anything. He's just there accompanying almost. So he becomes that almost like a side quest. You know what I mean? But he's very intriguing. I think that's why he became the standout of the
Very
entire
much
franchise.
so. Yeah, the makeup and stuff is pretty fantastic for all the Cenobites, I would say. It's really one of the strengths of the effects of the film. Because I mean, they just stick in your head. Like, they
Yeah.
they are infectious. So I completely understand why that imagery stuck with people and why he kind of became such a marketable face. But I mean, yeah, again, it's still surprising that, for a franchise that leans so heavily on him. But again, we also have Friday the 13th, where it's like, that first film, Jason is literally in it for 5 seconds at the end, and it's a jump scare. So it's like, he is not the focal point. So it's like, you don't even get Hockey Mask Jason until part 3.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where it's like, if you come into Friday the 13th, you're expecting Jason with a hockey mask, but you don't get that for a while. So it's like, it's not as uncommon as I think it feels, but it's been a long time since I've had an introduction where this has happened, I'd
Yeah,
say.
well, and like with this kind of thing is, um, like you're saying, where Friday 13th is also that kind of, we don't see our definitive Jason Voorhees till part 3, where it really does seem like all these horror films that have been franchised over the years really started with a very specific vision. Friday
Hmm.
13th was a specific vision. Same thing with Hellraiser here, where it is essentially not a slasher, but more so a love story in the realm of horror.
Yes.
And that's what it started as. And I've seen 1 and 2 here. I've seen clips of 3 and things like that, but my guess here is that it really just became, what a Friday 13th became, where Pinhead may have become the main antagonist. And I guess I could be speaking out of turn here because I haven't seen the other ones, but I did see what some of the 2018 one. It just really just kind of seemed like that's what the franchise had become, whereas Pinhead's the main antagonist and not just the accompanying figure at that point. So I feel like maybe this kind of shifted and fell into that kind of academic equation that a lot of the other franchised horror slashers had become. Again, I don't know. It's hard for me to say that I can jump into anything after 2 because I just know that it's never been looked upon so positive.
Yeah, and I think that's there's you mentioned a lot of good stuff there that we're going to be getting into because like this is a very different horror film, like in the sense of what I was expecting. Like it does of course have its violence, its gore, and those shocking moments, but like you're right, this does ultimately at the end of the day come down to almost more of a gothic romance
Yeah,
between
and I love it.
these two sadistic characters. And yeah, it's the strength of the film. And I think it goes back to the brilliant writing of Clive Barker because he adapts his own work here with the Hellbound Heart, and he adapts it to the screen. And I think that it's done masterfully. I mean, you can tell it's a story that he has thought a lot about, and that is something he's very passionate for. So it's like I think that all I can say is that works to a T.
Yeah.
And I'm excited to dive right into it.
Yeah, and this is one where we did kind of jump into the Sunday Scaries, where we pay tribute to Stephen King, and I kind of mentioned a little thing where I think maybe sometimes Stephen King's got a great concept of a story, but maybe he's not the right person to write the screenplay, where he tries to put too many ideas that don't necessarily seem cinematic. Whereas Clive Barker, I mean, this is a novella. I don't think it's that long. I think it's less than 200 pages. So kind of him. He's a person that has that talent to take his source material and be the guy to turn it into a screenplay. Because looking at this first film here, I mean, he's firing on all cylinders. I think he hits all the points.
No, I would agree. But yeah, I think it's about time we hop into our first segment, which we so lovingly call Account of the Macabre.
The film which you are about to see is an account of the tragedy which befell a group of 5 youths. In particular, Sally Hardesty and her invalid brother, Franklin. It is all the more tragic in that they were young. But had they lived very, very long lives, they could not have expected, nor would they have wished to see as much of the mad and macabre as they were to see that day. For them, an idyllic summer afternoon drive became a nightmare. The events of that day were to lead to the discovery of one of the most bizarre crimes in the annals of American history, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Alrighty, so yes, this is where we get into the synopsis of the film. We give you our best. Basically, when we do this, we each rotate, we each pick a pick. For those who don't know, we have a lot of new faces on the channel, so we each decide, what we're going to be covering. So this was my pick, Hellraiser. So I write the synopsis. For last show, it was Child's Play 2. So obviously Luke will write the synopsis on this. So there's a varying degree here of quality, I like to say, because I think Luke gets his nice, precise, and in the bag, as to where mine tend to ramble a little bit.
I like yours though.
Oh, thank you. But yeah, this is my plot synopsis for Hellraiser. So just kind of jumping right into it, and then obviously we're going to discuss the film and all the goings abouts. When Larry and Julia decide to move into Larry's childhood home, Julia begins to become wrapped up in an old flame of hers, Frank, Larry's brother, who appears to have been squatting in the home, but is now nowhere to be found. Like forbidden fruit, Julia can't seem to stop reliving her affair with Frank just days before she was to wed her husband, Larry. Frank is a very horny and sick boy, obsessed with the pleasures of the flesh, but never satisfied. This is what got him in trouble in the first place, exploring an ancient puzzle box said to hold all the pleasures and pain a man like Frank could ever want. As the couple continue to move into their home, Larry injures himself, causing himself to bleed profusely in the room that Julia is reliving those memories. This could be presumed as Frank's old bedroom. I don't really know why I put that in there, but I felt it was important to say. Once Larry's blood makes contact with the ground of the room, we watch as Frank begins to reform piece by piece under the floorboards. Once Julia finds out about this, she is terrified, but driven by lust and curiosity, she's easily convinced by the zombified Frank to assist him in getting his body back. So Julia would then spend the remainder of the film seducing unsuspecting men, bringing them to the room where Frank lives and killing them so that Frank could take their life force. All the while, we follow Kirsty, the daughter of Larry, who is an unsuspecting of any of the strange things going on until one afternoon when her father, Larry, expresses his worry about how his wife has been acting as of late, and he requests that Christy go and spend some time with Julia, only to be shocked and horrified when she learns the truth of what's been going on inside her father's home, witnessing a skinless, mostly formed Frank, as well as the murder victims Julia has been collecting over the film. Kirsty would take the puzzle box from Frank that he so longingly and lovingly protects, and she leaves the home. She would then wake up in a hospital where, after a few turns of the box, trying to figure out what it is, she finds herself in the presence of the Cenobites, demons to some, angels to others. They are about to punish Christie until she informs them of Frank's escape and offering to bring them to him. They agree but make no promises on letting her go afterwards. Once Christy returns home, she finds that her father and Julia are there and have told her that they have destroyed Frank and all will be okay. But it's not long till Christy connects the dots and finds out that Frank has not only killed her father, but now wears his skin. All out chaos erupts as Julia and Frank try to kill Christy, resulting in Julia's brutal death by the hands of Frank. And Julia tricking him, and Christy tricking him back into the room where the Cenobites wait for him. They take Frank back to hell in a brutal and gory fashion and then attempt to claim Christy, but she gets away, leaving her father's home in ashes. The film would conclude with a homeless man who we had seen periodically throughout the film, following and keeping a close eye on Kirsty, walking into the fire and the home and walking into the fire of the home and collecting the box. Next, he reveals himself to be a bony dragon and flies off into the night. And then we end right where we began, at a table with somebody else inquiring about the puzzle box. So there you go. That is Hellraiser in a nutshell for you guys. That's all I
pure
got.
perfection. Nah, it was good, Dylan. I liked it.
Thank you. I'm trying to get better at it, but
You're doing Clive Barker proud there.
I hope so. I really don't think so, but hey, it is what it is.
Take the compliment.
And this is a really weird movie, man. Like
Very.
this is strange for this time in the 80s. I mean, like we had said before, we're coming into really, this was 1987, so we're kind of coming down to the end of the big slasher boom. But it's still very profitable at this point. It's still, a lot of people are still very familiar with it. Horror is doing well. So this to be kind of coming out, I guess, really must have been a sign of the times of, we want to start doing something a little different with this. We can't just keep putting killers on masks and in your dreams and whatnot. We got to really show a little bit of what more horror can be. Because nowadays, I feel like you can just get just about anything from any sub facet of the genre. People are more accepting and open to it. But back then, I would say this was a pretty ballsy take to kind of sell this as a new slasher villain, but then be told this love story between Julia and Frank, and just the lengths that they're willing to go to be together, even when she should know that Frank's actions are not pure.
Yeah, and that's what I'm curious about here, because now, did you go into this completely blind? Did you know the story around it going in, or was this totally new?
This was, for the most part, I knew of Pinhead. I knew that there was a guy whose name was Frank, who was a skinless corpse for some reason. I knew that he was trapped by the Cenobites. I did not know that Julia was going to do what she ended up doing as far as like kind of collecting bodies, but I knew that she was at some point in this, and I couldn't really figure out where Kirsty fit in, just from my general knowledge. So when I went and watched this was basically as fresh as it could be, living in this space for as long as I have.
Okay, because like for me going in, I saw this film a few years ago, so I was a little late to the game in terms of Hellraiser as well. And me going into this, I just figured that it was going to be in line with a lot of the slasher things. And so, when you're sitting there and you're realizing that's not what you're going to get, you kind of have to come to terms with, am I on board for this or am I not on board with this? Would you say you were at least, I mean, were you in any sense underwhelmed by the storytelling here in terms of, were you thinking you were going to get a slasher and then didn't, or did you were you prepped at least a little bit to know that it wasn't going to be a pure slasher? Like,
I wasn't prepped that it wasn't going to be pure slasher, but it was more enjoyable. I would say, as much as of a slasher fan as I am, it was nice to see this as not just trying to fit itself into those shoes.
yeah,
Because I've never, and granted, I'd never really seen him on screen work, but like the concept design and look, and I know that, Pinhead's more of a slow moving kind of all powerful deity and less of a I'm going to chase you down and hack you to pieces with a machete kind of guy. So, it's one of those things where it's like I was very happy to see this kind of be taken into another route. Really, the only thing that I think again surprised me and slightly disappointed me was that Pinhead's not in it as much, because I wanted to kind of get to know what the hype was with that character.
yeah,
I understand it, and looking at it as what I know now, seeing the film as a whole, it's like this was never, I think, intended to really be that kind of a, we're going to keep doing this, we're going to keep putting him in, and this is what it is. Like he
yeah,
was, at the end of the day, I think we said it a lot in what it looks like for the new Hellraiser, as to where the puzzle box is more of a character. I
mm,
think that was the intent here. It never really gets to that point, maybe in Hellraiser 2, because I didn't get to finish that, but I know the gist of it and I did my research on it. Because, like I said, we'll cover it at some point down the road. So it's like I didn't want to get too exposed to it. But, it's one of those things where it's like I kind of was just taken aback by that, but also welcoming it, because it
yeah.
is nice to have something that's a little more different. Like I said, a little bit more of a gothic romance here.
Yeah, and that's where I'm at with this as well. Because I did watch 1 and 2, and I can say, like, when we're talking about the lament configuration little box, it's like, where we said it's more of a character. It seems like in the trailer, at least right now, going into those first 2 films, the box is emphasized to a certain extent, and I would say, combined with those two first films, would be what we get from the trailer. You know what I mean? So it's like they achieved the emphasis of the box in that trailer, as opposed to the first 2 films from the 80s. So I would fully expect going into the 2022 film that the box is going to be a little more of an actual character itself. I think that's probably what they set out to do. But going back into the Hellraiser film, in my first viewing of this one, where, I went into it expecting, in line with maybe a Friday 13th. And then I realized, about 20 minutes in, that's what I wasn't getting. And I was kind of sitting in the moment at that time. And I was like, okay, so I'm getting something different here, and I'm loving it, because it's like at that point, 87, we're probably sitting with what, Jason Lives, maybe Jason Part 7. I don't know exactly where they're at in that timeline, but at least Jason Lives had come out at that time. So it's like, looking at that film, he's reanimated by lightning, um, and then he's off to the races, where we don't really have time to sit and take in anything. Tommy Jarvis is running crazy, to the sheriff's department, saying, we got to take on Jason right now. And we're just straight off to the races. You don't have a moment to breathe. Whereas Hellraiser is such a long-winded kind of slow burn for the most part, where we're sitting there and taking in the elements and just what Clive Barker has intended in terms from taking that novella and making it into a film, where we're just sitting there taking all this in. It's such a slow story. And then by the end of it, I mean, all hell breaks loose, legitimately, in the
Yes,
last
yeah.
15 minutes. So it's like, kudos to films that can do that, especially with an audience that is so used to that slasher franchise, especially in the 80s at that time. So it's like, I could see people a general audience going into this film, seeing the character design of a Pinhead, or the Chatterer guy, like all these different Cenobites, and thinking, I'm going to get something different here, and not being pleased with it, walking out of the audience, because it's like, people live and die by ratings. And as we were doing research for here, I think it sits maybe at 70% on Rotten Tomatoes, but take that for whatever you want to. But it's kind of like, the people that are going in looking at this film now can really go back and appreciate it. But much like a Halloween 3, where it's like, the general audience going out of that film, I could see people going out of this film saying, but that wasn't really what I wanted in terms of what a September release going into October. You know what I mean? Where there are elements of horror, but it's not strictly, again, this is a romance story set in a horror world, so I could see this not pleasing a general audience at that time.
No, I agree, and I think it's a ballsy take. It's definitely refreshing on our end, and I think that there definitely would have been people who would probably be disappointed not going in expecting that.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I think that the fact that this film has aged with the reputation that it has and has continued to have, I think like really shows just the like a lot of like amount of people that really do appreciate it for what it is. It's a more of a mature tale than what I think they're used to at that time with the slasher genre.
Yeah.
As to where this is, like I said, it has to deal with a lot of taboo topics too, where it's like it is kind of leaning a little heavier on the lust and the affair and like just more of the sins that you can commit in a relationship or how far you'll go to reach these wonderful sexual experiences, and it's through everybody. I mean, Frank is the utmost extreme of that, as to where Julia shows what she's willing to do to be satisfied, just by going along with this whole thing with Frank and all that. And there's a lot of great visual imagery in here. I think about when the affair is committed, them fooling around on top of the wedding dress and things like that. Like it's just very much a more mature story, and how they go about telling it. And I think that it's, again, probably why I think it's been held in such high regard for as long as it has,
Yeah.
because I think that it can grow with you. So even if you watch this as like a teenager and you're not about it, you're not into it, I think the older you get, the closer you'll get to the fear of the material and kind of what it's trying to express to you.
And again, like you're saying, this is kind of a mature take. I really believe that as well, because we're dealing with a more mature issue here. Whereas, like, you look at a lot of the other slashers, they don't go into a deep story. But here, I think we see Pinhead at the very beginning after Frank is ripped apart, when he solves the box. And then we don't really see Pinhead at all till way later on.
In the
So,
hospital.
yeah. So it's like, there aren't this deep horror of this kind of character looming at that point. But once we see him, and then we move into the vacant house where Larry and Julia are moving in, and it's kind of this relationship. And then we're doing these flashbacks in between. She asks about Frank and him not being at the house. And we don't really know the dynamics of the whole relationship at that point. But then we're starting to get these flashbacks as they're moving, as to Frank and Julia and what that dynamic is. And I think when you're saying as you get older, you can appreciate those things. I think like going through certain relationships, and everyone has different issues, but kind of the fear of a significant other cheating or having it actually happened, all those types of things, I think resonate with an older audience. So it's like kind of going in for, I guess, a light, fun experience. I don't think you really get that with Hellraiser, because this is a more evolved kind of storytelling, where it's meant to resonate with an audience as they grow older.
No, I agree. And, like looking at it, there's a good piece of trivia I wanted to pull for this conversation. So it reads, the film was originally supposed to be called The Hellbound Heart, after the novella upon which this was based on. The studio decided that the title sounded too much like a romance and asked Clive Barker to change it. Barker offered sadomasochistic from beyond the grave, which was rejected for what? Why do you think they would reject that, Luke?
Well, especially at that time, there's no way that was gonna fly. Where you hear all these stories about certain random things being cut from these horror movies. That would be like, does it really matter that much? So to say like sadomasochist from Beyond the Graves is going to be like the main title. I think is half the people are not going to understand it, and then
Mm-mm.
the ones that do are going to be thinking this is a very different film.
Yeah, because it comes off as overtly sexual content
Yes.
is why they decided not to do it. So you hit the nail on the head with that one.
So, and it's like one of those, it doesn't roll off the tongue either. So it's like, settling on Hellraiser makes sense. I mean, what he wanted to call it Hellbound Heart, Hellbound Heart, right? Which is the
Named
novella.
after the novella. Yeah.
Which I think would have been a fine one, a fine name. But again, yeah, I understand why they felt like it came off as a romance. But Hellraiser rolls off the tongue, but when you really look at it, it doesn't make as much sense as the Hellbound Heart because that's what it's about. So it's like it makes
And
sense to be called that.
the studio really wasn't about that. They wanted this to be marketed as something more than a romance film.
Yep.
He ultimately opened the floor to the production team to offer up their own suggestions, prompting a 60-year-old female crew member to offer up the title "What a Woman Will Do for a Good Fuck." I thought that was a pretty funny piece of trivia,
Missed
and very,
opportunities.
it opens the door to really showing where their heads were at. Because, we were
Yeah,
just talking about like how this is a different story than what we're used to. And even the production or the producers behind it, they really wanted this to be more in line with like a Friday the 13th or something like that.
absolutely.
But it's just not that kind of material.
And
It really isn't.
and at that time, I mean, even now, but I mean, especially at that time, the obsession with making everything into a franchise, where it's like the Hellbound Heart 2, you know what I mean, or Hellraiser 2, where it's like, okay, that makes more sense. That they were probably trying to find something that's marketable in terms of, if we just want to do, if this gets to 10, 11, that we could just do something that rolls right off the tongue, easy to market. And I feel like that's where everyone's head was at in terms of kind of when you're coming up with that title.
And I do have another piece of trivia here that goes along with this conversation. It's a little longer, so bear with me. According to Clive Barker, as the writing of the Hellraiser script took place during the height of the Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, and Halloween film series, his intent portrayal of Pinhead was an accurate and intellectual, it was to be an articulate and intelligent character. Was initially not well received by the producers. Some suggested that Pinhead should act more like Freddy Krueger and crack jokes, while others suggested that he be a silent character like Jason Voorhees and Michael Myers. Barker insisted that Pinhead's personality be more evocative and of a Christopher Lee portrayal of Count Dracula. Part of the chill of Dracula surely lies in the fact that he is very clearly and articulately aware of what he is doing. You feel that this is a that there's a penetrating intelligence to him. And I don't find dumb things terribly scary. I find intelligence scary, particularly twisted intelligence. It's one of the reasons why Hannibal Lecter is scary, isn't it? It's because you always feel he's going to be 3 jumps ahead of you. And I think that sums it up perfectly. I mean, if you're looking for any amount of like proof or anything, it's all right there. And I mean, we pulled that really just from our viewing of it and just knowing the time period. But Clive Barker has said it right there that he had a lot of pressure from producers to make Pinhead more of like a Freddy. And I just really think if he would have went with that, this film would have been garbage and they never would have spawned a series, whether, say it's for good or bad. I mean, because a lot of these sequels aren't great from what I understand, but it is one of those things where it's like you would never have Pinhead in the conversation. He would never have his own NECA figure if that's the route they would have went.
Yeah, and I keep hanging my hat on the slashers, and I keep referring to Friday the 13th. And honestly, going into this film, for some reason, I thought it'd be more in line with the Nightmare on Elm Street, not the Freddy version, but more so when you're dealing with hell and kind of pulling people into these realms, which they do some of that in Hellbound, but not really in the original Hellraiser here. I mean, there's a couple of elements, but more so it's Cenobites actually coming, to Earth, in this world rather than bringing the characters there. I mean, we see a little with Kirsty a little bit later, but it's only a very brief taste of anything. So for me, it was very surprising to see us not really dive that much into the world, but we know that the budget here wasn't really the biggest thing, but we'll get into that. But it's like going back to Pinhead and the characterization to make him intelligent, I think for me, that's what makes him more scary. Where Freddy, especially at the time when I started really getting into Nightmare on Elm Street, even as a kid, it was what a lot of people deemed MTV Freddy, where he's pop culture, he's out there cracking jokes, he's become that part of the general audience, pop culture. He's marketed even to kids, even though he's this razor fingered maniac. Whereas Pinhead never really was that. He's more intelligent, and mentioning Hannibal Lecter in that little description, I think pinpoints it perfectly, where Hannibal Lecter's scary because of how intelligent he is and how articulate Pinhead is, even with the little bit of dialogue that he does have, the way that he presents himself in this more serious manner, and kind of he shows that kind of reasoning almost, where he's making the deal with Kirsty to get Frank back and all this other stuff. I think that's a great dynamic that they've added to that Pinhead character, because that does set him apart from everyone else. That's kind of, I think there was a void there in terms of the characterizations, in terms of these kind of killer slashers, whatever you want to call them, and I think they kind of developed that perfectly with Pinhead.
No, I agree. And I think that overall, it's, really can come down to it. It's probably my favorite part of this movie, in the sense of just like the way they do end up using these characters and the way they choose to tell their story, because it sets it apart. It is ultimately unique to anything else that we get from, this kind of storytelling. And I could definitely see now, after watching this, why films like last year's The Night House get brought into conversation for that being an unproduced Hellraiser script.
Yes.
And how that all fits together. Like, they are really leaning into a lot more with this, the romance and the horror that could be involved with something like that. You know what I mean? And it's just like, it's refreshing. It's adult. It's nice to see. And I could see why this character means so much to certain people, but maybe not so much to others.
Yeah. It's a fun space to play in. Again, I haven't seen the third one. I can't believe, because even the second one's an adequate follow-up, I feel. I think, like, again, where we go into Friday the 13th is its own film, and then what followed was kind of became more in line with the franchise feeling. I think this is a perfect comparison to Child's Play 2 in terms of Hellbound, because where I find Child's Play 2 to be my definitive Chucky, I really feel like Hellbound took the ideas of Hellraiser, and Hellraiser being such a small film that maybe they couldn't capitalize on a lot of things that you would think should be in Hellraiser, and they started opening that world in Hellbound. And for better or worse, it feels like they probably took those elements and expanded upon them in the 90s and the 2000s and stuff. So it kind of really lost its way from that kind of small Clive Barker storytelling from the original Hellraiser.
No, I completely agree. But I think that's going to wrap us up here for this section. I think we got a nice, good bit of conversation there. And so that way we can kind of keep the show moving, because I know we've spent nearly an hour in some of these recent shows this segment. So let's kind of wrap ourselves in a little bit and move on to the next segment, which we call Behind the Mask.
Happy, happy Halloween, 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 happy, happy Halloween, Silver Shamrock.
It's almost time, kids. The clock is ticking. Be in front of your TV sets for the Horror-thon. And remember the big giveaway at 9. Don't miss it. And don't forget to wear your masks. The clock is ticking. It's almost time.
Happy, happy Halloween, 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 happy, happy Halloween, Silver Shamrock.
I'll always love it. Love that music.
Gosh, I just, not to get off, well, we always get off track, but I just dusted off Halloween 3 as if I need a reason, but maybe there's some sort of Halloween 3 content coming your way sometime soon. But, man, what a sex maniac Tom Atkins still is.
Oh yeah,
Wild.
definitely. And I mean, hey, if this is the podcast to talk about it, for
There we
sure.
go.
But yeah, so this is our behind the mask segment for those who don't know, where we're going to be talking about more of the production side of the film. We go deep into the guts and innards and find out what really got this whole thing rolling. And for the most part, as far as from the last couple things we've covered, I would say the last two movies, they kind of had it. Things kind of kept moving at a pretty good pace. We didn't really have a lot of holdups. We didn't have 6-year delays like we did with Dog Soldiers. We didn't have all this other stuff kind of,
Anything of rights or anything like
yeah,
that.
rights or anything like it. It all has been going pretty smoothly for the most part. Like there was definitely infighting amongst this movie when it comes to the producers and the creatives, but that's pretty much expected across the board with any of these kind of 80s horror films. It was a very lucrative time for horror, and producers wanted to get their hands in as much as they could. Um, and for some, it worked. I mean, some of it, like, Friday the 13th, we keep going back to it, was produced to basically be a Halloween knockoff. So it was just a producer's wet dream at that point of just like, let's put this thing together so we can make a ton of money off of it. And then it spawned into the franchise that we know and love today.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Were you done?
Oh no, you can go ahead.
Because I didn't mean to cut you off. But so I was going to mention, because I did listen. I didn't get a chance to actually read the Hellbound Heart, but I did listen to the audiobook coming to this podcast, because I think that's probably one of the biggest things. I mean, I already brought up Stephen King, where going from the novelization or novella, whatever you want to say, whatever the source material is, and kind of transferring it into that visual medium, there could kind of be a contention there. So it's like, I think that was kind of where we're talking about this going smooth, where Clive Barker was a man who wrote the novella and then had the chance to write the screenplay. So it's kind of like they're transferring there. It becomes fairly smooth, but then when you're dealing with the studio, sometimes they want other things that kind of they want it their way. You know what I mean?
Oh
Where
yeah.
and I think there were a few things in here. One of the things that I don't know, you touched on the story at all in terms of the alterations?
Oh yeah. I mean, we
I
could
don't want to step
definitely
on
get
your
into
toes.
that. You can go right ahead right now, honestly. Like you're on a roll, so.
One of the things I wanted to bring up that I wanted to talk about a little bit was this kind of the Kirsty character, where
Mhm.
very different in terms of what we get from the novella as to what we get on the film. They changed the dynamic there in terms of Kirsty was just a next door neighbor that kind of had an affection for Rory, who became Larry. So there are minor changes there, but they changed it. Obviously, if you're listening to the podcast, hopefully you watched the film where Kirsty is now Larry's daughter. So they really did change that kind of family dynamic there, where it was non-existent in the novella, then became a thing in the actual film. So I don't know how you feel about that, but for me, I thought that was a very interesting dynamic. I think that
It's
brought a lot for
it's
me.
interesting, but yes, I think like to make, and you have the original writer adapting and directing. So, they kind of, I think, more or less saw it in a way of how he could take his material and improve upon it a little bit. Because I have not dived into the novella very much. I know a couple of the fun facts about it and some of the stuff that you're bringing up. So it's awesome that you were able to get through it and actually like give us a little bit more intake into it. But like, it is one of those things where it's like this to me, I kind of understand a little bit more why they might go for this approach, condensing some of your characters to make the relationships a little more simple. And considering the film isn't like it doesn't overstay its welcome. I mean, isn't this thing that's only like an hour and 30 something minutes?
Yeah, this
So
one's not. This is a quick runtime.
yeah, so it's like they kind of had to condense a lot of that stuff down. I feel like, trying to get into the whole yeah, it's only an hour and 34. That's what I thought. So if you kind of get into the whole like, oh, she's his neighbor and this is how she knows him and blah blah blah, and you have to bring everything else into it, then I think you run the risk of your runtime going up. And I know, knowing what we do so far about these producers and kind of what I've researched in it, is they were very much looking for that quick, we want to attract the teenagers to the drive-in, get them here, get their money, get them in, get them out, and get another screening up. So, but it's just, again, the most drama you're going to have is you have Clive Barker just coming in with this being his material, having a completely different vision to what the producers had. But he stood his ground. I mean, like, you got to give it to him. That's probably the biggest thing I wanted to cover in this side of things, was that Clive Barker did stand his ground where he could. And I think very much still got to tell the story that he wanted to tell, which I think is very important and very rare for that time period, because you hear all these stories of creatives getting steamrolled. But I think when, he is the original creator, he kind of maybe held a little bit more respect, considering he had to sell his rights and everything to them to make this movie, and they agreed to bring him on board. So it's like they kind of, I think, knew they had to let him tell his story the way that he wants it told.
Yeah, and I can't remember if the change in dynamic, that Kirsty character was a studio call. For some reason, I thought it was a Clive Barker kind of alteration to the story, just to kind of facilitate.
I believe from my research it was, again, because I think it's a little bit more forgiving and a little bit easier as far as going into more of a screenplay take on it. Just being able to kind of tie up some of these relationships, bring them a little bit closer. And because, in a novel, you have pages upon pages. You could spend 4 pages talking about the relationship, between characters and really getting it set clear. But in a film, without sitting there and giving a bunch of exposition, or, going into 4 pages of dialogue, just trying to get everything set, when you are kind of held to the expectation of, we want to get butts and seats, we want to bring people in here, we're not trying to tell some kind of deep story, it's not a drama here, is what the producers don't want to sell it as. You kind of, I think, are forced to kind of rework your story a bit more and kind of bring people into, like, we're taking the neighbor, we're making it the daughter, we're gonna just kind of take that whole thing and just have these 3 characters already know each other, be established, be connected, and we'll go from there. And I think, knowing what I know, you can tell me better because you've now understood and read or listened to the Hellbound Heart. I think it's a smart way to go. I still think that the story feels whole and intentional, and it doesn't feel like they've made that many alterations, watching it.
And I think these kind of going from the novelization to a visual perspective there, I think it's needed in terms of alterations to give you a reason as to why you're doing it, because oftentimes if you go verbatim, a lot of people prefer the book because of what's going to be in their head. So I think sometimes there are these alterations when you get to that visual medium that make the screenplay and the visual dynamic a little stronger. And I do think that change works way better as to making her the daughter, because one of the things I do want to bring up here is this kind of incestuous theme. A little bit, it's touched on maybe a little bit more in 2, where Frank and Kirsty actually share a kiss, and it's very unsettling to see on screen, knowing the dynamic, and kind of making her the daughter in the original Hellraiser. I think where you had brought up earlier, Clive Barker saying that, calling them sadomasochists from beyond the grave, that kind of connotation that would have in terms of like bondage and, whips and leather and this stuff. I think that kind of incestuous theme works so well into what Clive Barker wanted to convey on screen and what kind of theme he wanted to get across there. Because one of the things I want to bring up here, where it's such a small line, but the way it's presented and the dynamic where he says, "Come to daddy" to Kirsty. And I believe that he does say that in the novella, but obviously there wouldn't be really a context there because she's just a next door neighbor. So kind of saying that to his actual niece is very unsettling and weird, and kind of heightens that kind of dynamic of when she's in the damp room with Frank when she first sees him, and he goes, "You're very beautiful, and you grew." And it's so, ugh. You already want to take a shower from watching this film at the very beginning, but as Frank is delivering those lines, it gets even grosser.
And I kind of, I want to bring this up too, because there was a podcast that I listened to where they were kind of discussing this. So at one point, Kirsty has a dream in which she sees this sheet and there's blood and you hear this baby crying and all these other things. And I think it's a little more widely from what they were discussing, a little more widely understood that there is a little bit of a hinting towards possible molestation from Frank
Yes.
towards Kirsty's character. And, that when I rewatch that scene after hearing that take, really makes you sick to your stomach. I mean, just as as a father and everything, it is one of those things where it's like this, the idea of that happening to your child just really adds a whole nother layer of sleaze to Frank if you kind of use that as the meta in your head. And it is truly unsettling stuff. And I think that it could also really enhance your experience as far as making you uncomfortable and making you understand that these relationships are dark and they are
Yeah.
deep and they are not fucking around when it comes to this. And that's again another real mark I can give this film as a positive, because it does change itself. Like, of course, we have movies like um Sleepaway Camp, where it's like it's a forced almost transition of gender, if you want to call it that, where that's a fucked up take and that sucks. But it's one of those things where it's like to kind of have this movie come out in that time period where those films and the Friday the 13th films are coming out, where it's all relatively simplistic. I would say, The Burning is very simplistic in its story. And then you have Friday the 13th, which is, kind of the benchmark. It's kind of telling the story of a slasher and kind of what to expect in the 80s. And then you have something like A Sleepaway Camp that tends to try to add a little more to it. But then you ultimately, I think, hit this point where it's like, this is very different. And it's not trying to be that. It's almost like a wolf in sheep's clothing in that sense. I know I'm
Yeah.
kind of rambling at this point, but it's just kind of my stream of consciousness where it's like, this movie has a lot more going on for it than just, the creep factor of Frank. And I guess that's really where I'm trying to kind of circle this back and just say that those undertones being presented do show just the amount of character work and care that there is put into this, as twisted as it is.
And I never really read into that scene. It always kind of confused me a little bit, because I never really dissected it until you're kind of bringing me this, and it does make sense actually. And I keep jumping into Hellbound, and I know you said we're probably eventually going to get to it, and I don't want to
No,
expand
it'll be
upon
a
on
little
too many
while, so
things.
go ahead and say what you got to say.
Because I feel like this is another significant scene where she meets Frank when they
Mhm.
kind of go into that realm, and he's in his own personal hell, and there are these women under these sheets, and they're in these white sheets covered in blood, and they're being pulled out and going back in. I think this is kind of his own personal hell in sorts of temptation, and a white bed pulls out, a bed with white sheets all pull out. Is this where he kind of corners Kirsty, and they do this kiss, and she kind of tries to lure him in to think, okay, she's for it, and goes to the bed, again, a white bed. So I really feel like there's a significance there where, in terms of her memory, where there is something there, because in Frank's personal hell, where they're making things resonate to him, it's white sheets, white pillows, all this stuff. So there has to be some sort of significance there. I'm really, really intrigued to really pick that one apart, because I think there is something there. Because I've always felt that there was more to it when Frank sees her as she's grown.
Mhm.
You really pick up this kind of, ugh, this is not new. You know what I mean? Like, we've been here before.
He has seen this, and again, I think it does show a little more restraint and maturity in the tale to not make that
Yes.
the lean as to where we are telling a story of, at the end of the day, and respectfully, a consensual affair is kind of the hinge to it. So it's not like we're leaning on child molestation or rape or anything. As I think when you're dealing with something as sadomasochistic and everything as this story is, it would be the kind of dirty, easy route that I could see producers going into, because you're going to get a guttural reaction from that. But no, they decided to kind of only use overtones of that. So when you're more thinking about it afterwards is when that fear and that disturbingness really starts to sink in.
Yeah,
Um,
in like kind of going into the flashbacks with Julie and Frank, where you see Frank's forcefulness, and
mhm.
I mean, in that first scene where we see Frank at the door with Julia, you can tell Julia is intrigued with Frank, maybe enamored a little bit, but his forcefulness, where she, welcomes it to a certain, and they kind of consummate and all this stuff, where you can see that that's the dynamic Frank brings. So that's probably with any sort of intimate relationship, whether it's going to be welcomed or not welcomed. So it's kind of like this very deep character that you pick up. It's not told to you, as in a direct line, but peripherally, you're seeing these kind of things and putting these elements together. And where you're bringing up where there's, at this point, Friday the 13th is Friday the 13th. Nightmare on Elm Street's Nightmare on Elm Street. We have this very specific dynamic in terms of terror and this force coming after these campers, kids in the town, whatever you want to do, whatever the story is, where Hellraiser really decides to bring almost this mental anguish where we're dealing with these incestuous relationships and kind of weird themes that we're not really seeing in any of the other prominent kind of slashers or horror
Temptation, I
franchises.
think,
Yes.
is a huge like word you could throw over this, in the sense of like it is the horrors and the the atrocities of falling into temptation. I
Yeah.
mean, like, and I'm not even trying to come at it from a religious angle, and I think, like, they do a good job of not coming at it from a deeply religious angle either, because again, that's another, I think, safe bet to it, where
Yeah.
this is played more straightforward, as this is just what it is. um and I think a line that really hammers that home is when Pinhead says, angels to some, demons to others, when he describes the Cenobites.
Yes.
So it's like, we don't sit here and just say, we are what we are. It's like, this is just, it's up to interpretation. It's just
Yeah,
like,
it's
if
up
you're
to
here,
perspective.
yeah, if you are here to seek the pleasures of the flesh and understand that there is no real line between pain and pleasure, then yeah, they would be angels to you. But if you have stumbled into this and you aren't about any of this, then this is truly hell, and they are demons of hell.
Yeah.
And I think that just is really, again, so smart and so different than anything I've seen before, as far as a large slasher icon, and just how they handle that through this. And I think that, again, it gets me excited for this remake, because it's going to be awesome to see a more serious take on this material that we haven't gotten in a
Yeah.
while. So I like
And
that.
you're talking about this kind of perspective in terms of it's kind of really high end developed storytelling where a series that me and you've both touted, Midnight Mass, Mike Flanagan, where you look at the characters there and, a vampire or an angel, you don't know. It's really about perspective here, So, like here, where you're saying, Frank played with the box and eventually, welcomed these Cenobites, until you kind of get to your own personal hell in a little bit, but you got to take the pain to get to the pleasures in a sense, and sometimes you're either for it or you're not. And it offers this very intriguing dynamic that I you were saying kind of you can expand upon in books that you can't really do in the film because you're moving so quickly. And that opening scene that's really just limited to probably what 15 to 20 seconds of Frank
I'd
messing
love to get more into that.
with the box.
The pursuit of the box would have been nice to see, and just
Yes.
like the
It,
understanding and developing of it. And I wonder if we're going to get that with this reboot. I
I'm
wonder if they're going to
intrigued.
dive into it.
I honestly, I think like this new one is really going to be kind of a mesh of that first and second film, where we're going to get some ideas and themes. We're going to get the Pinhead backstory and things like that, but we're also going to get this overlaying factor of expanding the world so that we get our full gist of it, not just a small small story like we get in the original Hellraiser. They're going to bring in the kind of themes from Hellbound as well, is what I really could see us getting into.
I agree. And then a couple pieces before we move on to our next segment here that kind of take us back a little bit more into the production. I mean, like, you know, we talked a lot about it, but also it's just like that's the things, like there's a lot of really deep tones and overtones and things in this film that I think really affected both of us a lot on this viewing. That topic will continue throughout this, I can guarantee you. But would it shock you to know that this movie was only made for $1 million?
Knowing that this is such a small story, you can easily see that they made use of it.
Mm-hmm.
But like, it makes sense that it was that small of a budget just because, you can't really do that much. Like, I really feel like if Clive Barker could have gotten another $4 million, he would have totally expanded upon so many other things in terms of Pinhead. But I feel like we don't get a lot of the Cenobites, probably because it just wasn't in the budget to do so.
Yeah, and it earned about 20 million at the box office, and this is
Talk about
for
a
Clive
return.
Barker. I know, for Clive Barker coming off of only 2 short films before this.
And
Uh,
sorry.
no,
And
you're good. Go ahead.
just to mention, the novella came out in 86, I believe. So
Hmm.
it's like, again, we're going from 86 to 87, and we're getting a budget for a film, a small budget, but then we're getting that kind of return. I mean, what an achievement.
Oh yeah, and Clive Barker speaking about the production and just actually working on the film the day by day, spoke about the film fondly in the Hellraiser Chronicles, which is some behind the scenes like BTS special features footage. Uh, stating that his memories on production were of unalloyed fondness. The cast treated my impunities kindly, and the crew were no less forgiving. Barker admitted his own lack of knowledge on filmmaking, stating that he didn't know the difference between a 10 millimeter lens and a 35 millimeter lens. If you'd shown him a plate of spaghetti and said that was a lens, he might have believed you. So it's like it's really nice to see that. I mean, again, you're dealing with a through and through creative. They are the writers of the book, so the vision is there. They know what they want, and I think that is half the battle when it comes to being a filmmaker or a director, especially. Is like you have to know exactly what you're trying to create. Like you can bark orders and you can have people shoot this and shoot that, but if you don't know the shots you're trying to get and you're just kind of shopping it around on set, that's when the messes really start to crop up, and that's
Yeah.
when things start to fall apart. So it's like it is one of those things where it's like, is directing an easy job? A lot of people claim it is, but a lot of the people that you hear are actually doing it understand that you are taking on so much responsibility and stress and just having to pull yourself in so many different directions that it is an extremely hard job. But it is one of those things where it's like, as long as you stick to your guns and you have your vision and you just do your best to fight the studio, get your actors corralled and make them do what they need to do, then you will come out on top.
In looking at Clive Barker, to know that this is, he's a very novice director and doesn't really know 100% what he's doing, and to kind of be earnest in that and just kind of say, I don't know the difference in these lenses. I think that makes a stronger crew,
Mhm.
having that director saying, I need help, and then being able to get that help. I think kind of develops this kinship almost in creating an actual film, because I know, again, jumping into Hellbound, a lot of the same people came back for that sequel because they felt like this was a good franchise. And I think
Yeah.
everyone kind of,
I believe it was the entire production team from behind the scenes came back for that. And I think that just goes to show you, because I think, like, you know, one of the things that I've always heard from filmmakers I admire is, when you have a crew and you have people who were hired to do these jobs, let them do their job.
yeah.
Like have them come in, be open to, ideas, critiques, criticism. Don't sit there and play I know best. At the end of the day, you are the decision maker, yes, but sitting there and undermining your crew and saying, I know how to do your job better than you is not the way to go about it. And I think, like, having that humility, and you're right, that the kind of attitude that Clive seemed to have brought to this, I think only benefits the film, again,
Yeah.
because it is beautiful. And for only having $1 million and the kind of effects that they pull off, really there's only one effect in the film that I can even sit here and say is kind of weak.
Yeah.
And I think that's the general consensus. But even then, it's like, it's still an intriguing idea, and it's still really good. There's a lot of effects in here, effects shots, that are very complex, but pulled off beautifully.
And that goes, kudos on that budget too, where, a lot of the things in here, yeah, I know the effect that you're talking about. I think it's a pretty good talking point for a lot of people, where to look at that and that be the only thing, and that because of a clear budgetary issue, and to achieve everything that they did in this, where, saying that it's like what, $1 million, and to achieve everything that they did in terms of storytelling throughout this film, where it does feel small, but it doesn't feel small, if that makes any sense, where it's like the small budget doesn't hurt the production in any sense. I think it feels like a small story, but it feels like it was supposed to be a small story, so I think it works, and I think that is attributed to such a strong crew and just a great dynamic on set, because like we're saying, the last two films we've talked about, where it was like, oh, this happened and that happened, where it's like we don't really get a lot of that with Hellraiser.
It seems like everything behind the scenes really, um, went very smoothly. I mean, as smooth as it could. Of course, they had issues with the MPAA and everything, where, of course, a film with this kind of content and everything, Clive Barker was smart to go in and anticipate that. So before submitting the film, he went through and retrimmed a lot of that questionable stuff that he knew they'd be kind of hitting on, to try to hopefully lower the kind of backlash that they were going to give it.
And
Um,
sorry, one of the things that I wanted to bring up, why I wasn't sure if you, because you're kind of segueing into the MPAA stuff. One of the things I wanted to bring up in terms of the opening scene with Frank that was expanded upon a little bit, is that when he is when the Cenobites come out of the box, and where he's grabbed with the chains and things like that, as he's going through that pain, one of the things that the character does in the novel is pulls down his trousers and relieves himself a little bit, and it kind of, uh, you know, as he lays on the floor, he releases himself a little bit, and kind of creates this whole dynamic in the damp room, where eventually Roy spills blood on the same spot, kind of maybe creating this opening where Frank's able to get through. Where I can see why that was never expanded upon in the actual film, because I mean, how do you even go about doing that in terms of ratings? And another
mhm.
very intriguing part is they kind of expand upon where initially Frank is in the wall. He's not even
Yeah.
and they mention this dynamic of when you're not going through the hell that the Cenobites are putting you through in terms of torture or anything like that, you're kind of forced to look at the space you were last in. And that's kind of where you just live until the Cenobites are ready for you again. So he's always just consistently looking through the damp room, waiting, if Julia walks in or Larry walks in, or else he's just staring in a blank room, which I don't know if they ever touch on that anywhere else in this franchise. I just thought that was an interesting kind of like dynamic in terms of your own hell that you're living in, or what you're doing when you're not being tortured by the Cenobites.
I agree. And I think I'll move us along here into our next segment. But before I do that, I did want to mention another interesting piece of trivia that I think kind of sets the real way that this film kind of feels unique, in the sense is that the film was originally set in England. It was going to be in London when they shot it, and that's where the film was going to be. I mean, that is where they shot it, but for the most part, they moved it last minute. Producers who were obviously financing the film said they would only finance if the movie was set in the United States. So they switched it to Brooklyn, but they still shot it in England. But they tried their best to make it look like Brooklyn, and I think that's why you get such a unique feeling to a lot of this. Is
Yeah,
that it doesn't feel like either place really. It almost feels like it's in a world of its own, and I
its
think
own
that goes
space.
to add to some of the strange feelings, and just the way this movie handles itself. I think the only thing that really gives away how it feel like the most England that it feels is when he gets to the hospital.
Yeah.
It very much feels like American Werewolf in London in those couple of quick scenes.
And it's very interesting because, I think one of the things is that what they dub over a lot of actors' lines to make it feel more American. And I still think there's that stigma out there, but maybe it's lessening a little bit in terms of like foreign films, films that were not shot here. I mean, like maybe Game of Thrones had a lot to do with it. I don't know, but where it's like I think especially that stigma in the '80s, where if a lot of Americans did not want to see anything that was in another space other than America. So, like you're saying, where they kind of wanted to pivot to Brooklyn, but it doesn't really feel like Brooklyn. And I totally get that in some of the shots where she's like running outside. It doesn't really feel like that. It just feels like it's its own moment in time, like Gotham or something like that, where it's its own space, it's its own unique world. And I think that does add to this almost otherworldly effect in terms of, hell and the Cenobites and in the box and all these other things. I think that inadvertently added to a lot of the aura of this film.
Heck yeah. No, I agree. I would say that does a lot for it, even though it wasn't the filmmaker's intent in the end of the day. But it was a nice happy accident,
Some happenstance right there.
There we go. But I think we can move on to our next segment here, which we so lovingly coin as "You Are All My Children."
You are all my children now.
So this is the segment where we like to get into the cast and crew. We like to kind of give everybody a little spot of representation and just kind of go over their work and everything and what we appreciated, what we didn't appreciate, and what we think, overall worked or didn't work for us. So obviously we've talked a little bit about it, but I wanted to start off this one with Clive Barker specifically because he is pulling double duty here as the writer of the novella and the director, as well as adapting his own work to the screen. So, this is quite an undertaking for him, especially being a real first-time filmmaker, and, it being self-admitted as not being as prepared as he would like to have been. But I think that the passion bleeds through and carries this movie because with the product we get.
Yeah, absolutely. He knew exactly what he wanted to do. And I think this is really, you can look at this, and this is where it comes in handy to have the director being the person who wrote the source material, because they know what they're capable of in terms of if this doesn't work, what can we do that's going to be true to the source material. And I think that's why this film is as strong as it is that vision and kind of Clive Barker steering that ship. And Clive Barker is a filmmaker in general. I mean, you look at Nightbreed. I mean, a lot of the things that he does, there's this dark tone to it. And I know we had just recently talked about Rob Zombie, and I really feel like Rob Zombie has set to achieve what Clive Barker always achieves. I think that's kind of what I always feel like what Rob Zombie shoots for, but never fully gets there, whereas Clive Barker can continuously come out and do it, because Hellraiser is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, I think that he understands the kind of story space that he likes to play in, and I think that he understands it very articulately, and he can always get his vision out there.
He mixes this kind of the gore and the storytelling perfectly all the time. I think
absolutely
he's a complete filmmaker.
I like it a lot, and I like to see where he evolves from this, going into like Nightbreed and stuff like that, which is one I'm sure we'll get to at some point down the road.
Of course.
It's going to be one that we'd like to talk about. But yeah, then we can kind of get into some of the cast members here. I have them written in no real like order of importance, but I guess the order that I wanted to bring them up in to me. So we talk about Ashley Lawrence as Kirsty. I think that not only can I say that I just grew a crush on this woman as I was watching it. I think that she's very beautiful. I don't know, there's something about the way she carries herself. She feels like a Nancy from almost Nightmare on Elm Street, but also just wholly original at the same time.
Yeah.
She's a very good final girl. I would say that she never once plays into any kind of tropiness. She's very sure of herself, and very much, just seems like a real person throughout
Yeah.
this whole movie. And I think the performance goes well. And I was just really impressed with her character, considering I would say she's not even the main focus for probably the first 40 minutes or so.
Yeah, not at all. And I think she's perfect casting. One of the things where, like, looking at the other kind of slashers and everything, sometimes it takes me a minute to really grow into the protagonist that we're on board with. Like, and sometimes it doesn't even resonate with me. Like sometimes Friday 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, some of them always blend. I mean, you have Nancy, like some of the more prominent ones you always remember, but some of the one-offs, it takes me forever, and sometimes I don't even get there before the credits roll. Whereas Kirsty, as soon as she's on screen, she comes off as likable, and so it's like you're already like wanting to make sure nothing bad happens. None of the Cenobites get her. It's like you're always invested in any scene that she's in because of that looming danger. Like as soon as she's in that room with Frank, you just want to grab her and get her out of there because of how freaky he is and how likable she is. So, I think if you would have casted someone else, maybe that dynamic wouldn't be there because of her likability factor. And honestly, like I've seen the first two, I know she's in that third one as well. And so it makes me want to go actually watch that third one. I think she's in one in the early 2000s as well. So I really want to see that Kirsty storyline play out. So I'm very intrigued, if not just for her, to see how this works out.
No, that's excellent. I did not know that about three, so it does make me more curious to continue on. And then next up, I have Doug Bradley, of course, as I have it written here. Pinhead, aka the lead Cenobite, aka the priest, which, if you know in the script in this first film, he's never referred to as Pinhead. Pinhead was something that was dubbed to him in between the release of this film and the sequel. It was kind of more dubbed by the masses and had to have been, it kind of stuck. So it was one of those things where he had to bring it in. And Clive Barker has openly stated he hates that name. He
Yeah.
thinks that it demeans the character. And it again, because he went for more of the intellectual, articulate, intelligent prowess of this character. And he feels that this kind of deludes it a little bit. But, I think that as time has gone on, it is a staple of the character, and I don't think it really affects the image that he wants. It is truly what he is, and it's one of those things where it's like you hear Pinhead, maybe you chuckle a little bit, but you see what we're talking about, and you'll be like, oh shit, okay, so that's some real stuff.
And that's where audiences, I think that's the affection for the character, to be honest, where we mentioned Cloverfield in the Sunday Scaries and Clovey and, all the predators have their own special names, given to them by the audience and everything. So, I don't think that takes anything away from the character. I think that just kind of turns up the volume on how loved the character actually is. And for me, I find it a little scary, to be honest. I think that the character design in general is terrifying, but I think Pinhead is obviously, it's self-explanatory. It works for the character. It's not like too tongue-in-cheek, I don't think, at all. So I think it works. But Doug Bradley as Pinhead, oh boy, perfection. Like, I think in the novella that not even touched on, in the sense where I think the main lead Cenobite is female, and there's a scene that very expresses that the Cenobite is female. And I think maybe it's the Cenobite is only mentioned by name by the engineer, maybe, or something like that. I think it's at the end, unless I missed something. But I think they kind of take that character that is very limited on that novella and then kind of expand upon, because there is no real description in terms of what we get with Pinhead here. So to kind of take that kind of character, bring it to life with Doug Bradley, was one of those things where you see so much potential in a novella and your mind goes to a billion different places and don't really know where to start. Doug Bradley, perfect casting. Like there's no other person I feel like that could have played that kind of serious, scary, and intelligent all wrapped into one. he works on so many levels as Pinhead.
Very controlled performance,
Yes.
I would say. I like that a lot. And then we kind of move into Claire Higgins, who played Julia, who to me is kind of one of our more sympathetic lead antagonists, I would say, is because, although she does agree and she continues on to go into this, you brought it up a little bit earlier where there's this forcefulness from Frank.
Yes.
Where it's like, I think that she does get something out of the relationship, but at the same time feels like, well, I have to do this or something will happen to me.
Yeah.
So it's like it kind of walks that line very well. But watching her go out and collect these men, these victims, and everything is probably the most entertaining part of the performance because, you kind of see her as she continues on. The first one is very awkward, very, not sure how to handle it until she gets to the part where she smacks him with the hammer. But as she continues, she is very much spinning the spider's web and pulling these men in and just letting Frank devour them. And it is very, very unique, very powerful, very creepy performance, I would say.
And the Julia character compels me so much here because you can't really describe so many characters like this, but strong and weak because she's such a strong character, and since she takes the idea what Frank wants her to do, she takes that into her hands and develops it and figures out how to do it, and then she pulls the trigger on it. She's the one that's hitting these guys with hammers, taking them into the wolf's den in a sense, making this, she's facilitating this to bring Frank back. Without her, none of this was possible. So it's like she's such a strong character in that. But especially like in the novella, they don't expand upon it too much. In the film, for me, it feels like this has been an ongoing relationship. In the novella, it's dwindled down to the bare basics of it was one time, and it's kind of sat with her for so long. Where kind of Frank has kind of is perceived to be kind of gallivanting around. She hasn't seen him, has taken various lovers, obviously in the film where you see the box of all his pictures and things like that, where she was not the only one. And he is really manipulating her to do anything that he wants, where he kind of keeps going back with, I love you and all this other stuff. Yeah, very controlling of her. So it's like, she's kind of both strong and weak. And I think, what's her name? Claire Higgins? Is that what you said?
Yes.
She brings that perfect dynamic there where you look at her and to be hesitant, but you also want to be in her presence. And it's like she pulls that off so well. I'm curious because I didn't do any research, unfortunately, on any of these actors, but I know a lot of UK actors tend to have a very different upbringing in the sense where they're not just film actors. They start on stage for a long while and then they're brought into kind of the film industry. So I'm curious, I'm assuming a lot of these actors have the background in terms of stage acting because they all have a particular presence about them in terms of like little mannerisms and everything that go such a long way in this actual film itself.
No, I would agree. I think that she's definitely a huge part of my enjoyment of this movie. I like to see what her character goes through because, I mean, she is truly being tempted in a lot of ways. And, she kind of just almost gives herself over and lets herself fall down this rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And then, we finally end up into just where she ends up. I mean, by the end of this film, she is betrayed entirely. She's stabbed by Frank unintentionally, I'd say, but when he does it, he doesn't stop. Like he's just like, yeah.
And it's just like a sorry baby. You know what I mean? Like he doesn't even care. You can tell that she was almost meaningless to him. But I will say, again, bringing up Hellbound, she's prominently featured in Hellbound, and oh my gosh, she steals my heart anytime she's on screen. So she carries Hellbound perfectly. I'm glad. Spoilers, sorry for anyone who hasn't seen Hellbound yet, but and then we get to see her and Frank again. So definitely worth a watch.
Oh yeah. And then kind of getting towards the end here, we have Sean Chapman as Frank, who obviously we've stated already gives a very sleazy, horrible, like just this greaseball performance throughout this film. And I think that he works to his strengths. He knows exactly what he's supposed to be doing, and he executes it very well. And I mean, he has limited screen time as far as Sean Chapman's concerned, but it is one of those things where it's like he is, he's creepy, and you definitely see that there's something fucked up about him.
He, even though his screen time is limited in terms of actual skin, he's very prominent. He makes those scenes kind of count when he's in them because you don't trust him at any point when you do see him, especially his interactions with Julia to start off with. So I will say he's sleazy with skin and without. So it's like, to kind of carry that kind of performance. Is he also doing the performances under the makeup? Do you know?
I believe he does the voice, but we're getting to that where
Okay.
Oliver Smith plays the corpse, the body of Frank.
Okay.
So it's a very different actor underneath, but it is also it's kind of the melding of two performances.
Yes. And I think that's kind of a very interesting dynamic because obviously you don't see that a lot to try and maybe mimic some other actors' mannerisms. And I don't know how much of that's going on because Frank has so much limited screen time when he has skin. So again, that has to be a different performance because you're layered in makeup. So you have to make those body movements count so much more and almost an over exaggeration in performance because you're under that makeup so much.
I would agree. And then that brings us to our last actor here, which we haven't mentioned, Andrew Robinson as Larry.
Yes.
So, giving a very, I would say, caring father. He's really good at that. Not the greatest, I guess you would say, spouse. Seems pretty basic, pretty level-headed for what Julia ultimately wants. He more plays it as the safe bet, and I think he does a great job. His performance, to me, really like his range, his acting doesn't really get to come in until he starts to portray Frank.
Yes.
And that's where you really get to see him dial it up, and that's the most fun I think he has in the film, and I think it's intentional. Early on to play him as very plain, very like saltine crackers, kind of the way I would say his performances, where it's just extremely plain. It's not all that impressive. He's just really hitting his marks well, but he's just he is what you'd expect from the doting father. And then he really gets to just rip all that off once he gets to be Frank for those final moments.
And that's where, I mentioned in terms of Frank with skin and without, where it's an interesting dynamic between two actors trying to kind of meet mannerisms to make sure that's the same character. I think that goes the same here with Larry, where it's one actor playing two characters, so you have to really be mindful of the things that you do and don't do. So, like, to kind of strip all that away and just to make him very cookie cutter throughout the majority of the film, I think is absolutely intentional. So that we can't really pick out too much. But then when he becomes Frank, we absolutely know that's Frank. And I think that's when the actor's having so much more fun because it's like when he's doing enough of this cat and mouse shit, it's like that's really where you're really seeing a lot of this acting come out. And he's, for all those scenes that are not very memorable at the very beginning, once he becomes Frank, all those scenes become memorable.
No, I would agree. But that's going to pretty much bring it up for this segment, unless there's anybody else that you really wanted to touch on.
No, I don't know if you're going to touch on it where the actor that played Larry talked Clive Barker into using
the final line?
Yes.
If you want to get into it, there you go. I know that's your favorite now.
Yeah, I've been reciting it ever since we decided that we were going to do this podcast, and I've had several viewings of this. Were you going to bring this up already, or?
Oh no, go for it. I was gonna mention it, but I didn't know exactly where.
Okay. What was the actor's name? I'm sorry.
Oh, you're talking Andrew Robinson.
Andrew Robinson. So originally the line at the very end was going to be "fuck you," and Andrew Robinson had talked to Clive Barker saying maybe it should be "Jesus wept," and he talked him into using that line. And I think for a lot of people, that's probably the most, if not one of the most memorable lines and scenes. And I think that adds in so much because I think in the novella, he just does the licking of the lips before he's pulled apart. So he doesn't really say anything. And I think they say, he wanted to be defiant in that idea. And, fuck you is a certain level of defiance, but to kind of do that kind of religious connotation of Jesus wept, I think is even more defiant when you're dealing with the Cenobites in hell.
Yeah, and I think it's played beautifully. Again, it does work a lot better, I think, than the just fuck you. I think fuck you is just too simple, too easy, and it is a nice addition. It just sticks with you. I mean, you've been reciting it, but I think it does. It sticks with you. So
Yes.
the good call there, Mr. Andrew Robinson. Alrighty, so that's going to bring us into our next segment, which we call Creatures Features.
You gotta be fucking kidding.
Yeah, so this is a great one to talk about special effects. Obviously, we get to discuss the Cenobites now in grave detail here. And I think, like, just coming off of it, these are there's four of them, I believe, in this one,
Yes.
correct? Yeah.
Yep.
And they are four very unique characters.
Very
and
different.
I like it a lot because it does ultimately serve everybody, that every single one of them, whether they have dialogue or not, in a very unique light. They are all very different from one another, and they play to their strengths.
I know, and that's where it's like visually, you don't know where to start with these things, especially from the novella where there's really nothing expanded upon. So looking at all four different character designs and them all being unique, and only two of them, like you said, having or not having lines, only two of them do have lines here. So it's like you really have to make those other visuals stand out, especially if they're not going to be actually speaking. So you have to make all these characters memorable. So you're not, well, we end up making one the lead, but you want to make them all memorable when you're going out. So each person has their favorite. And I think you really do that with all these different unique and terrifying designs.
I agree. And I think, universally we can all say that Doug Bradley's Pinhead is probably the standout. But I think that, a lot of people always talk about the Chatterer as being like their
Yes.
favorite. He was definitely an enjoyable thing to see here. I know that he reoccurs a lot in the franchise. And
unsettling. Just
Mhm.
doesn't have any like verbalization lines like that where he's actually saying something of note, but that just the chattering that he does is scary as hell. Like I
Oh,
hate
yeah.
hearing it. It's so utterly, from an audio standpoint, it's displeasing, but it adds so much to the scene of when you're just hearing him on screen doing his chattering. It's ugh.
Yeah,
Hate it.
and I think like Butterball, unfortunately for that actor, him and the Chatterer both actually did have lines that did end up going to the other two Cenobites because they couldn't really speak through their prosthetics.
Yeah.
Which is kind of why you get that. So like Butterball definitely got the shorter end of the stick with not even having that chattering, but still a very intimidating and very disgusting and despicable looking Cenobite. So visually, he's definitely got a lot going on for him.
And just a mannerism, because there is a scene where Butterball licks his lips at one
Mhm.
point, and again, I think that's just attributed to the acting standpoint of you have to make those movements count so much more because you're not speaking. To make it unsettling from just a visual perspective and the way you carry yourself, I think it is a big kudos because the Chatterer has that audio of at least being able to chatter, which is unsettling, where Butterball has nothing. So you really have to make those visuals stand out, especially when you're on screen with three other terrifying looking characters.
I would agree. And I think that ultimately they all really do stand on their own as far as speaking roles go. I mean, we already talked about Doug Bradley quite a bit in his performance and being able to have this element of control to him. And honestly, like I should have probably pulled this off a little earlier, but what's the fourth Cenobite, the one we haven't mentioned yet?
That one I'm not
Dubbed?
sure. I was hoping you were gonna lead me to the water on that one, but to
Yeah,
talk
I'll
about
I'll get us there.
the character design of Pinhead. I mean, like, my gosh, just the prosthetics alone for that one, so intriguing to kind of come up with that kind of character. And to make all these kind of, I think the concepts are how they were tortured is kind of what they're visually what they look like. So I think that's such an interesting kind of dynamic you bring to the Cenobites, because you're always, whether they're only on screen for a certain period of time, but you're always wondering their backstories.
Yeah, and she is actually just called female Cenobite, so
Oh,
that is
okay.
why we never got a name.
Okay.
So, but it is one of those things where it's like I very much appreciate her performance as well.
Yeah,
Very creepy, especially I like when she's coming up the steps at the end and
that's what I
dragging
was
her
gonna
hands
say.
across the wall, and there's blood coming out of it.
Like, for her to still be called just female Cenobite is kind of ridiculous, because I was kicking myself as we were speaking, because that's such a prominent scene of when she is confronting Kirsty on the stairs and going into the room. I feel like that's such a prominent scene for the Cenobites, because the other two don't have any speaking lines. That she should actually be given a name at this point. I can't believe that she hasn't. But again, she is really carries it. I mean, Doug Bradley gets the bulk of the lines, but the things that she has is absolutely unsettling. She's got the hook, she's sharpening it. She's terrifying in her own right.
No, I agree. And one of the things that they talk about, of course, it's always to be expected with makeup like this, is just how long the effects would take and the undertaking that these folks had to kind of go through. There was a lot of times when Doug Bradley, especially in makeup tests, would miss his marks just because he couldn't see through the contacts that they gave him to black out his eyes. So he was having a hard time kind of moving through shots and things, which is why he is still more of a slow or stagnant performance as we go along through the film.
Again, you talk about happy accidents, though. I think that works so well.
Yes. And, I think overall, the other real big piece, because I know we talked about a negative effect, which is something we don't really talk much on in, this on this podcast. We try to remain fairly positive, but there was a pretty effect that it works for me, but I could see not working for others in this large, what has been described as phallic looking, which I don't necessarily agree with, but monster that kind of marches its way into the beginning of the third act when Kirsty is opening the box for the first time, and then is shown up right there towards the end of the film. Very briefly, where it's just kind of this beast that chases her down this hallway. Probably the weakest effect in the movie, but it
Yeah.
is with $1 million as your budget and how much you've already spent and where you're going. I could see it as being very tough to pull off for that crew.
Yeah, and I think it's fine in its initial concept, going down the hallway where you don't see that much of it. But as you shed more light on it, it's kind of, it's not horrible, but it's just like, maybe we could have come up with a different design here, because it just seems like it's hard to kind of move and maneuver, and to kind of practically make it in terms of, like, I guess, a fight between the protagonist and this weird looking thing. So it becomes a little awkward, but it does feel a little Nightmare on Elm Street-ish, where it seems like it would be something that Freddy would take the form of. So, and that's where it's like, I think we get a little taste of that kind of hell, I guess, realm, if you want to call it that, where they only do it sparingly, but I think it does add to the aura of the film.
Mm-hmm. And then I guess the last piece that I wanted to discuss was pretty much almost all the effects involving Frank, everything from his
Yes.
resurrection to him walking around without skin, and then including his death, especially being all very effects heavy things that, if not sold properly, would really hurt your film. But I think they really do a good job of making all of it look extremely uncomfortable and extremely horrific. I go back to one of the key things that stuck with me throughout this film is just how when he talks about that he can feel pain again, and just how excited he is about that,
Yeah.
just because he hasn't felt anything in so long. It's just like the effects and the way that the actors choose to sell them really go hand in hand together with that character, and I think it all works beautifully, especially the resurrection sequence. I think
Oh
like
my
that's
gosh.
all very, very well done.
And one of the things that's I think I remember looking up. I don't know who said it, but maybe one of the crew had said it. Where one of the biggest things on this film, one of their biggest friends were condoms and lubes in terms of effects. And I think like when we go under the floorboards after Larry spills blood and we see like the heart beating underneath the floorboards, and it's just like a giant condom. I think they said filled with, I think they were filling it with the corn syrup and things like that. I think that works so well. To think it's such a primitive effect, but visually, it pops so well. And then to think about when they say lube, it's like Frank. I think it adds so much. I always talk about like this wet goriness where Frank is always wet and disgusting. And again, it adds this level of sleaze that I want in my kind of gore, So it's like he's always wet, and then when they put him in the white and the white collar and everything, and there's red stains from his hands all over his clothes. It just adds to this level of disgustingness that is one of my big things of what I love so much about Hellraiser.
Absolutely, and I could easily see them doing like a Frank NECA in a way
Yes.
that they did the Wolfman recently, where it's like you kind of have a base body with the clothing, but you can remove certain pieces, and then he can be clothed or skinned or unskinned, I guess you could
Yes.
say,
This
and
would
then
that
string
would
him up
jump
with
at the
chains.
that jumps to the top of my want list, because I've watched Hellraiser forever ago. You never watched Hellraiser until recently, where we've talked about our NECA want list. And, it doesn't surprise me that this wasn't brought up because it was such, we weren't that aware of it. But now that we are, and you just mentioned that is at the top of my list.
Awesome. I'm really happy to contribute. NECA, please send us your way. We got a lot of ideas for you guys. Please.
There we go. We're going to start petitions, sir.
Absolutely. But I think that's going to wrap us up here, I guess, for Creatures Features. Definitely wonderful effects in this film. Something I'm more surprised that doesn't get talked about as much is that resurrecting Frank. I think that it's really an impressive effect.
I love it. I always go back. Like, that's something that I will watch. Even not watching Hellraiser in a long time, you always see that resurrection scene. I think it's on YouTube. It always pops up in kind of effects showcases. And I think that's honestly what Hellraiser is, where you look at, like you had said, would it surprise me that this being, $1 million film, is that surprising? And, looking at the story small, but the things visually that they pull off seems like, this would have been a fairly expensive film.
No, I agree. It definitely, it seems like it would cost more than it did, but it's awesome that it was very achievable on a lower budget.
It's inspiring.
Oh yes, but that'll kind of bring us into our final segment of the night there, ladies and gentlemen. Unless I know we didn't really discuss about it. We have our kind of addendum segment of the scripting changes. Do you have anything that you'd like to maybe add about that? I know we already discussed the novella in a great deal, but
nothing really. I think we can probably save this for the legacy more so than anything else. I don't really have any script changes. I don't think. I think this was perfect for a small story.
I agree, and I think that with the next couple weeks we will have a lot more Hellraiser to discuss.
Absolutely.
So there will be time for that. So I'll move us into our final segment here, where we give you our final thoughts into The Check is in the Mail.
Just listen to the old Pork Chop Express and take his advice on a dark and stormy night, all right? When some wild-eyed 8-foot-tall maniac grabs your neck, taps the back of your favorite head up against a barroom wall, and he looks you crooked in the eye, and he asks you if you've paid your dues, well, you just stare that big sucker right back in the eye, and you remember what old Jack Burton always says at a time like that. Have you paid your dues, Jack? Yes, sir, the check is in the mail.
Absolutely love that scene. I know we bring it up. We're always talking about our transitions, but God damn, I can't wait to talk about Big Trouble in Little China on this show someday.
That'll be a 4-hour podcast.
Oh, it will.
But we're saving that for when we're having Kurt Russell co-host. So
true. All the Kurt Russell movies are being saved. But yeah, so this is our kind of wrap-up segment where we just like to talk about our overall thoughts on the film, just where we come to it now after just getting to kind of deep dive into it. Again, I think really the sentiment that's been run through on Hellraiser here is just the surprise in the kind of story that it chooses to tell and just how beautifully it does it. Again, I put this on kind of a different level than I would a slasher icon. he might be that way to some, but to me, I think that it definitely feels more Lovecraftian, more cosmic horror in a sense. It lands on almost more of like a plane of like something like An Empty Man. And again, I
Yeah.
said The Night House, where it's like all these films feel like they could be playing on the same playground together.
Yeah, for me, I mean, like looking at Pinhead, and you're saying we put Hellraiser in kind of in a different playing field, which I do as well, story wise. But character design, I mean, he stands up for the best of them. You know what I mean? Like he's in that conversation in terms of just visually terrifying. Pinhead works on so many levels. Hellraiser, on in its own right, is just such a unique film, very different than what we were getting at the time. I mean, we've just gushed over it for almost 2 hours here, but such a great film, very different for that time period. But this is something that isn't your basic run of the mill kind of slasher horror at all. This is something new at the time. I think this probably doesn't get its due. Maybe now that there's going to be a new incarnation coming out, that I think this heavily influenced a lot of horror directors and maybe directors in general, just from a storytelling perspective, showing that you can really add a different dynamic to these characters and not just necessarily throwing kids at a camp and having someone, run through them all. So I really think that there's a lot to be looked at in terms of storytelling, effects wise. This is just one of those horror films that has to be on the best of list.
I agree. And I think that again, it sets itself apart from these other, ones that would be considered similar to it in the genre. But, to me, I was very happy to put this thing in as a blind watch and finally get around to it and actually be on the Hellraiser train a little bit, be on the Pinhead train. As far as the rest of the series goes, I'm excited for this reboot, this requel of a sense. And I am curious to actually sit down and give Hellbound a thorough watch and really give my thoughts on that. And I might check out, like you said, the others with Kirsty, but as it goes along, they'll probably be slower as I watch these sequels because I know that they get
Yeah.
pretty rough as the time goes on.
Yeah, to know that there's that many out there, it's like wow. I can't imagine the varying quality of these things, but um, we always talk about where this could go. I mean, we already know where it's going to go here in a few weeks, so I'm very intrigued to see how they're going to expand upon it. Looking at the ones that we do have currently, I think Hellraiser and Hellbound, Hellraiser 2 are such two great companion pieces because what Hellraiser didn't expand upon, I think Hellbound does to a pretty good extent. Looking back on Hellraiser in terms of where I would have went with it or where I think maybe they could have expanded upon, this being a love story, I really would have been intrigued when Frank got the skin to have consummated with Julia, and if she had become pregnant, to see how the
Yeah.
Cenobites would have handled that, just to be a product from hell. He escaped, wasn't supposed to do it. And what kind of dynamic would that be in terms of a baby from hell? What they would have done. I think that would have been a fun idea to play with. I don't think they do that in any of the other series. I don't know though, because I haven't. Other than the first two, there's still blind spots for me. So I'd be intrigued to see if they ever tackle anything like that, or if the new one would.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a very intriguing concept. When you explained that to me the other day, I was like, that's very cool. I like that a lot. Almost playing with this Antichrist aspect of how the Cenobites would handle it, whether they
Yeah.
see it as an angel or a demon.
Yeah. Would
Who
it be like a
knows?
pure product of hell? So
Mhm.
is it above the Cenobites in a sense? I don't know.
Who knows? But yeah, I definitely would say that this was a good pick. I was happy to sit down and finally add this one to the catalog. And yeah, I gotta say, I give Hellraiser a very high recommendation. It's one of those ones where it's like I understand the reputation of the film, and even more so, I'd say that there's probably a little bit more to dive into than your average 80s horror flick. So, it's something where it's like, just understand that, unlike us, if you haven't watched this, I don't know why if you haven't seen Hellraiser, I'm surprised that you're listening to all this,
Right,
but
we
hey,
spoiled it all for you.
there you go. But it's still an experience to go back to. But it is one of those things where I'm just like, I definitely was surprised going into this. I had expectations of what I thought this was going to be, but I came out seeing an entirely different movie, and
Yeah.
I'm happy to own it. I pulled the trigger on the Arrow Steelbook. It was sitting right in front of me at a place, a local used media store, so I pulled the trigger on that, and I'm happy I did, because it's nice to have. We'll be incorporating it to the background here next time we record. So.
In going into this, like I said, I had seen this a few years ago, but it was one of those ones where I did the double feature watching Hellraiser and Hellbound. And then I think maybe I was going to pull the trigger on the third one. And I got about 10 minutes into it and then maybe have called it. Never revisited after those first watches, even though I did like those first two films. And the beauty of this podcast is to give me a reason to go back and rewatch something a couple of times. So, I mean, like walking out of these podcasts, I'm in no shape or form an expert, but at least I'm well informed about the film and everything that went on around it and going into it. And I'm really glad Dylan picked this one to give me a reason to really deep dive farther into this, because this is worthy of someone's attention, of not just one viewing, but multiple viewings and really going into the story. I would even recommend the novella. I listened to the audiobook. I would love to go back and get my hands on a physical copy of this and to own it. But it's a very intriguing story in general. Clive Barker is a very interesting mind, very unique guy. To kind of come up with these concepts like this. And this was translated perfectly onto film, I think. This being a small film, but doesn't really feel like a small film. Again, cast and crew, can't speak highly enough of. This is something that if you're just a horror fan or a budding horror writer or director, you have to watch this one to really get that blueprint of great filmmaking and suspense and all those different elements in terms of character. So this one, can't speak highly enough. Must watch for anyone in the horror community. I'd even recommend it to someone who's not a horror fan, because there is a love story here.
I like it. I like it a lot. This was definitely a lot of fun, and I am even more excited for the requel, which we will definitely be coming back to you guys with our thoughts. It'll be definitely some coverage on that one for sure. That's, again, the whole reason I selected this was because I had never seen it, and with the new one coming out and my excitement, just knowing who's behind the film, I needed to finally pull the trigger on it. So that's the whole reason this thing got picked as early as it did. Because personally, if you would have told me when we first started this that I'd be picking Hellraiser so soon into it, I think this is episode 11.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where I'm just like, I never would have guessed that, but I'm happy I did, and I'm happy to be able to include it and now have him in the conversation, because who knows, if this one goes well on Hulu here, then we could be looking at a few more coming down the line. And I know there's the potential for that TV series to still come out. So
yes, we got potentially a lot of Hellraiser stuff coming out here in the next few years. So Dylan, I raise my glass. Kudos to you, sir, for a great pick.
Thank you. And I got to say again, now that I am, as I said earlier this week on a couple of our videos, since I've been diving into the Chucky series, thank you again for picking Child's Play 2. That was a lot of fun.
And I think that's the beauty of the horror community, whether we're doing a podcast or listening to a podcast, or just someone tweets something that looks like an interesting blurb from a scene from a film we haven't seen. I think that's the beauty of the horror community. It gets us all talking. We're always intrigued to consume new media, whether it's from the 80s, 90s, or upcoming things. There's so many different unique things going on in Shudder, Hulu, obviously coming out with a lot of stuff, Netflix. It's a great time. We always talk about it here on the podcast and everything else we do. Great time to be a horror fan.
I agree. And yeah, guys, so that's going to wrap us up here for Hellraiser. As far as things we got going on the channel, if you did not catch it, we posted our trailer on Friday last Friday, as of this coming out, of the Halloween Splatterthon. So that is finally a cat's out of the bag on that one. That is what's going to be going on all month long from October 1st to the 31st. Where we're going to be giving you guys all kinds of exclusive Halloween content, including the next podcast, which is going to be coming out on the 10th of October. So that is going to be amidst all of the Splatterthon goodness going on. And we always keep it a surprise for what's coming, and I'm going to continue that streak. But I will say that if you pay attention to the date of when that's going to be dropping and a little film that'll be coming at the end of that week, you can probably gather what we're going to finally be doing. We're going to be finally getting some feelings off our chest about not one, I will tell you, but two films in the next
jam-packed
episode of
episode.
Splattercast. So
I'm looking forward to it.
it's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be very therapeutic, and then we'll kind of get to go in and see what comes next. So
Comes the palette.
yes, I'm very much looking forward to that. Other than that, guys, you can always find our shows at Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, anywhere your podcasts are found. You can find these audio versions of these. And if you want to catch our other content, you can obviously right here on the channel. If you're watching us on YouTube, if you are not, feel free to hop over and subscribe. Like I said, we got a lot of new faces at the channel right now, so we thank you guys all for hopping on. If this is your first episode of Splattercast, thank you for making it this far. And yeah, definitely go back and check out the other episodes. It's kind of our flagship show here, and we really love doing it. Yeah, other than that, you can follow us at Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, all at SplatterCast Pod, where you'll be able to keep up with us on the day-to-day with all the horror conversations and news always going on. And yeah, I think that about wraps it up for announcements right now. Other than that, we had the Sunday Scaries come out yesterday, as well as our Munsters review. So feel free to check those out and let us know what you thought of all the news and the latest from Rob Zombie.
Positive or negative? I'm sure there's a lot of things, a lot of thoughts.
Oh yes, oh yes. But yeah, I guess until next time, I'm Dylan Newell,
and I'm Luke Janesco.
And remember, stay scared. And here we go.